Welcome to Module 6, Formulating and Adopting Strategies and Plans to Manage the Issues. Before we get into the content of this module, let's just first recap where we are in the strategic planning process. So we started the strategy change cycle, which is Bryson's preferred method of strategic planning, by conducting preliminary interviews, by doing preliminary stakeholder analysis, and conducting readiness assessment. So essentially, we began by creating our plan to plan. The purpose of the first step is to negotiate agreement among key internal decision makers or opinion leaders about the overall planning effort and the key steps. Obviously, some person or some group must initiate the process. Strategic planning doesn't just begin. One of the first tasks is to identify exactly who the key decision makers are. The next task is to identify which persons, groups, units, or organizations should be involved in the effort. The initial agreement should cover the purpose of the effort, the preferred steps in the process, the form and timing of the reports, the role, functions, and membership of any group or committee empowered to oversee the effort, such as a strategic planning coordinating committee, the role, function, and membership of the strategic planning team, the commitment of the resources necessary for proceeding with the effort, and any important limitations on or boundaries for the effort. Bryson outlines each of these things that should be covered in the text. We then moved into looking at our mandates, what are absolutely unchangeable things within the organization that cannot be altered, such as laws or ideological commitments, and we also looked at whether or not we have an inspiring mission. The formal and informal mandates placed on the organization consists of the various musts that the organization has to face. These are the various requirements, restrictions, expectations, pressures, and constraints that it faces. Musts, for example, include relevant legislation, policies, ordinances, charters, articles, and contracts that outline the organization's formal mandates. Musts also include the informal mandates that the organization faces. An organization's mission, in tandem with its mandates, provides the organization's most important justification for its existence. Clarifying the mission or purpose of the organization does more than justify the organization's existence. Clarifying the mission and/or purpose can eliminate a great deal of unnecessary conflict in an organization and can channel discussion and activity productively. Careful stakeholder analysis work should precede development or modification of an existing mission statement, so that attention to purpose can be informed by thinking about purpose for whom. The mission statement itself is very short, perhaps no more than a paragraph. From looking at our mandates and mission statements, we then moved into conducting environmental assessment. We went over SWOT analysis, which was strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. We also examined pest analysis, Porter's 5 forces analysis, and we then identified critical success factors and organizational competencies. One thing that I didn't mention about the SWOT analysis is that sometimes SWOT analysis is often called SWOT/C analysis, otherwise known as strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and/or challenges analysis. Sometimes we want to use the word challenges instead of threats Because when people think about threats, they often feel that this has a negative connotation. So challenges seems much more achievable in terms of what we can get done within the organization. The planning team should explore the environment outside the organization to identify the opportunities and threats that the organizations face. It should explore the environment inside the organization to identify any strengths and weaknesses. Outside factors are those that are not under the organization's control, and inside factors are those that are. Opportunities and threats are usually, but not necessarily, about the future, whereas strengths and weaknesses are usually about the present and not the future. Members of an organization's governing body are often better than the organization's employees at identifying and assessing external opportunities and threats. A formal external assessment process is suggested so that key considerations will not be overlooked. To identify internal strengths and weaknesses, the organization might monitor resources, otherwise known as inputs. They may monitor their present strategy or their process, and they also may monitor their performance or their outputs. Together, the first 4 steps of the strategy change cycle lead to the 5th, the identification of strategic issues. Strategic issues are fundamental policy questions or critical challenges affecting the organization's mandates, mission and values, product or service level and mix, clients, users or payers, costs, financing, structure, process, and or management. Strategic issues, virtually by definition, involved conflict of some sort or another. The conflicts may involve ends, means, philosophy, location, timing, and the entities advantaged or disadvantaged by different ways of resolving the issue. A statement of strategic issues should contain 3 elements. 1. The issue should be described succinctly, preferably in a single paragraph. The issue should be framed as a question the organization can do something about, and the question should have more than one answer. Second, the team should list the factors that make the issue a fundamental challenge. Third, the planning team should prepare a statement of the consequences of failure to address the issues. In this module, we'll focus on steps 6 and 7 of the strategy change cycle, formulating and adopting strategies and plans to manage the issues. For some organizations, depending on the size, these steps are often collapsed. A strategy can be defined as a pattern of purposes, policies, programs, actions, decisions, or resource allocations that define what an organization is, what it does, and why it does it. While there are numerous approaches to strategy development, Bryson favors either of 2 approaches. The first is a 5-part strategy development process, and the second is a mapping process where there is a need to articulate relationships among multiple options. We'll explore both of these approaches in this module. Once strategies have been formulated, the planning team may need to obtain an official decision to adopt them and proceed with implementation. In order to secure passage of any strategy or plan, the planning team must continue to pay attention to the goals, concerns, and interests of all internal and external stakeholders. Again, though, for different organizations, particularly depending on your size, steps 6 and 7 can be collapsed or condensed into one step. In order to understand how to formulate and adopt strategies and plans to manage the issues, It's first important to understand that organizations are always called upon to develop one of three agendas. The first is what will they keep and improve? The second is what will they initiate that is new? The third is what will they stop? And this is often the hardest of the three agendas to pursue. So how do you formulate strategies? To answer these questions, or these three agendas, there are two approaches that Bryson advocates for in thinking about how to actually go about formulating strategies to address the strategic issues that you identified in Step 5. The first process that Bryson advocates for in formulating strategies and plans to manage the issues that we've identified in Step 5 is the 5-step process to strategy development. In the 5-step process to strategy development, planners ask 5 questions about each strategic issue that has been identified. The first question looks at what are the practical alternatives, dreams, or visions that we might pursue to address this strategic issue, achieve this goal, or realize this idealized scenario. The second question asks, what are the barriers to the realization of these alternatives, dreams, or idealized scenarios? The third question looks at what are the major proposals might we pursue to achieve these alternatives, dreams, or idealized scenarios directly, or to overcome the barriers to their realization. The fourth question asks, what major actions, with existing staff working within existing job descriptions, must be taken within the next year or two to implement the major proposals? And finally, the fifth question that's asked in the 5-step process to strategy development is what specific steps must be taken within the next 6 months to implement the major proposals, and who is responsible for each step. In this 5-step process, step number 2 is often the unconventional step. Listing barriers at this point is generally not something that planners often do. However, when we list barriers early on, it helps us to ensure that implementation difficulties are dealt with directly rather than haphazardly. In looking at steps 4 and 5, we should always remember that strategies are always developed with implementation in mind. If there is no goal to implement the strategies that we formulated, then it's useless to try or attempt to formulate these strategies. One word of caution with the 5-step process to strategy development is that you may need to develop logic models in order to tie together different connections among the ideas and various categories within and across responses to the 5 questions that you're asking. Once answers have been developed to deal with specific strategic issues, the strategic planning team is now in a position to make judgments about which strategies actually should be pursued within the organization. The second process that Bryson advocates in formulating our strategies and plans to manage the strategic issues that we formulated in the 5th step is the oval mapping process. The oval mapping process creates options formed as actions to address each strategic issue. This involves creation of word and arrow diagrams where statements about potential actions that the organization might take, how they might be taken, and why are linked by arrows indicating the cause and influence relationships between them. In other words, arrows indicate that action A may cause or influence action B, which in turn may cause or influence action C. We can think of this as, if our organization does A, it can expect to produce outcome B, which in turn may be expected to produce outcome C. These oval maps can consist of hundreds of interconnected relationships. Important clusters of potential actions may comprise different strategic issues. In order to develop an oval map, participants simply brainstorm possible actions, cluster them according to similar themes, and then figure out what causes what. The result is your issue map or your oval causal map. This can be used in tandem with other approaches to indicate whatever logic is being followed in the organization. This is an example of an oval map. This map displays action to outcome relationships between the options intended to address the issue at hand. These maps can often get quite large, so software can be needed at times. One software that can be useful is Decision Explorer by Banzia.